Also, I think it's really important at the beginning of this to thank our sponsors. We've been very fortunate to have RMIT Publishing as our principal sponsor, and our other sponsors include the Australian National University, and we're video conferencing, video recording the speeches today, EBSCO, ACT Libraries, Zenith, ProQuest and University House. When we started planning a day to talk about the values of libraries, we were very conscious that we're challenged every day from a variety of different groups. Some of those who write to Professor Chubb also say to us there's no need for libraries anymore. Everything's on the internet. They say, why would you invest in libraries, in science? Why should we have institutions that are contributing to what we would argue Australian literacy, Australian competency, a nation that is effective and forward-looking. We've had a lot of these debates for many years, but there are particular challenges that come in the 21st century with the digital environment that are very important for us to talk about. There are a number of international projects in the space of the value of libraries, and we wanted to run today's symposium to enable us to think about what the challenges are, to hear some inspiring speakers who think on a broader plane, and to challenge ourselves to go back to the workplace and take some action to make sure that we are able to contribute to an effective nation. We are incredibly fortunate to have Professor Chubb as our opening speaker today. Professor Chubb is a very distinguished scientist and leader, and he is Australia's chief scientist, and we are very fortunate to have such an eminent chief scientist. He was appointed to the position on the 19th of April 2011, commencing in May 2011. Prior to his appointment, he was Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University for a decade, and prior to that he was Vice-Chancellor of Flinders University, and he has a very eminent career, and his advice to the government and to the nation is incredibly important. So I'd like you to welcome him here today.
Thank you, Professor Chubb.
Thanks, Roxanne. Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be back home. The number of times I've given a speech in this hall, I probably couldn't count. There are some people who think that because you're a scientist, you're not numerate, so I'll prove it. There aren't a lot of times that I've been here, and the number of times I've sat here wondering whether the ones that are not on are because the bulb was blown and we haven't changed it, or whether there's some fancy switch somewhere that gives you partial lighting. I suspect that it's the former, because I noticed that we've got new lighting here since I was here last, although I wouldn't like to read by that, either a book or a screen. Anyway, it's because of this particular occasion I've been reflecting on what libraries meant to me back in my youth and what they might mean today. My early years were in a regional country town, well, not in a country town, near a shop, well, not near a shop, some distance away from a shop and a school. And we used to get library books delivered to us in brown paper bags once every couple of days and sometimes once a week. A little later, when I was a young academic, we used to wait breathlessly for current contents to arrive in the library. It usually arrived within a week or so of its publication date, but the journals that it listed had been published some months before somewhere else, and we then had to wait many weeks, often, for those journals to arrive in the library once we'd seen their contents, their index page. And of course we were in the, I'm now talking about the late 60s, and we were trying to establish in a way an Australian identity in research. Let me just remind you that Australia produced its first PhD graduate in 1948. Until then, the universities in Australia were not expected to conduct research, although of course a few did, or there was research done in a small number of parts of some universities, is probably a better way to put it. We were, in the late 60s, after the first PhD graduate, some 20 years after the government in the 1940s, late 40s and early 50s, had decided that never again would Australia be in a position where it was an importer of knowledge from elsewhere, which of course they realised depended on elsewhere being willing to give you what you needed when you needed it, the knowledge that you needed to develop, to grow, to reconstruct after the devastation of the first half of the last century. And you needed knowledge to do that. And we were not generating our own. We were dependent, and the governments of the day, of both political persuasions, where we engaged in a robust contest of ideas, which is not always what happens at the moment, but we had a single-minded objective of those governments, Menzies, Chifley, Curtin, and people like that over those years, to grow a different Australia. So we were desperate to get hold of the journals that had the papers in them that we thought that we needed to know in order to take our own work to the next stage. And I think the librarian at Monash at that time was a woman by the name of Mrs. Bailey. Never to forget Mrs. Bailey, very tolerant lady of these young men who would burst through the door the instant before it opened and demand to see the latest journals that they needed to see because they thought they were going to change the world. We did. And we tried. But we needed the knowledge to be able to do that. A little while later I went to England and I was really surprised to see journals on the shelves before their publication date, printed on the front cover, before they actually appeared in current contents. So you suddenly realised where Australia sat. You realised where Australia sat when you saw that all of our so-called competitors, now we call them peers and colleagues, but they were getting access to information weeks, if not months, before we did. And that was a geographic thing, it was a transport thing, it was probably all sorts of things really that made it like that. Whatever the technicalities and the logistics were, it didn't alter the fact that as a PhD student in England, I had information available to me some months before PhD students in Australia had it. And so that enabled me to do things and to plan experiments to be, in some respects, I mean, I don't know that we ever saw it quite like it being a race, but we had a capability that was offered to us simply because we were able to get access to information sooner. And of course what's happened recently is that that's all changed. Now, as long as you can get access to a machine like that or even a smartphone, and you're in a place in the world where it can connect, then you can get information instantly, and you can get so much information that you probably can't handle it. And one of the striking differences about today and how it used to be, I think, is that everything lives forever. Whereas a journal article in the old days, if it was not a good piece of work or sloppy piece of work or something where the idea was leapfrogged by other people's work, it sat there on the shelves and it would get referred to for a little while, then it would drop off. But now you can make mischief if you want to use the internet. You can hone your research to find every negative bit about something or somebody, and it's there forever. What people say about you personally is there forever. What people say about your work is there forever. And just doing a simple search can toss all that stuff up, and you don't have to find out, if you don't want to, how it was refuted, how the processes of science revealed different and better information through the passage of time, through the passage of experimentation and exploration and observation and scepticism and criticism and hypothesis testing and evidence building. You don't need to follow that path if you don't want to. You can go back, pick a paper, and today you can turn it into a headline. So we live in a completely different world now, all sorts of reasons, but it's also with a lot of positives, but also with some of the negatives, where it does actually mean that we do need to be much more careful in what we do and say. We also need to be able to manage that information much differently from the way traditionally we used to do. And I suppose in a way, for me, I heard yesterday a story on the local news about a school in the ACT that's given away its books from its library to charity, and it's selling the bookshelves and the library materials because their students don't want to read books anymore. And personally, I would find it impossible to imagine a life without a pile of books by my bed, not all of which get read. There was a time when I could read 3 at a time, but now, halfway through a chapter, I have to go back and read it again because my attention span is not what it used to be. But that doesn't alter the fact that we are now turning out a generation of people in our schools. So the impact is yet to hit fully, I think, the universities, but it will. But in our schools, where they don't want books, so the schools get rid of their libraries, hand their books to charity and sell off the shelving and the equipment and facilities of the library. So in a lot of ways, this has gone full circle, hasn't it? I mean, I started out getting them in a brown paper bag, got used to libraries that were behind the time, behind the date, got used to libraries that were ahead of the date, got used to the internet and electronic world and being able to search for what you wanted, sitting in a train or whatever, wherever you were. Space was not the constraint at that time, to one where now something that we grew up with is no longer seen to be the most important thing or an important thing for us. But one of the things that Australia has to do, of course, is manage that information. There can be no doubt that the challenge ahead of us, collectively, the world indeed, but let's just focus on our little bit of it for the moment, that we have to be able to manage the information that is now pouring out of all sorts of sources and for all sorts of purposes. One of the things that politicians of all persuasions in Australia are rhetorically committed to, at least, is to move to a much more productive, much more innovative, much more creative society stroke economy. And as we move into that knowledge economy in Australia, as we've come to call it, the maintenance and management of information and the communication of it becomes of increasing importance. That's particularly true for us in the science disciplines, but not exclusively. So this is not an issue about science v the rest. This is simply me talking about an area that I know a bit better than the other, and but I do know that the huge growth in knowledge and information we have in the sciences is going to be a challenge for us to manage globally, but of course in this country too. There was a survey recently that compared high school test results between countries. In countries where a high percentage of their GDP was reliant on natural resources, like coal or uranium or oil or indeed iron ore, the results on international tests were quite low. Where the country had very minimal reliance on natural resources, the results were typically much higher. And one of the conclusions that's possible from the study demonstrates that perhaps where there's no alternative way than to rely on your skills and your talents and your knowledge, where there's no alternative way than to do that, people were more likely to value knowledge and skills and talent. Now, we won't always be able to rely on our natural wealth. We always know that one of these days they'll stick the pick in the ground and it'll be empty. We'll be at the bottom of the hole, and we don't know when that's going to be. We know it's not going to be tomorrow. We know that it's not going to be the day after tomorrow, but we also know that we're dependent on other countries wanting it. So it's not as if we're digging it up for our own use, we're digging it up for the purposes of sale to get some benefits back into Australia as a consequence of that. So it's volatile, it's predictable to an extent, but it's not certain in the ways that one would like to hope, and certainly the longevity is something that we can model and predict, but we can't be certain about either. So one of the things that we have to do, I think, is to make sure that we are ready for when all of that changes, and when we become like some countries elsewhere in the world, where we don't have great natural wealth, or not as much natural wealth, but we do have a great deal of wealth in the knowledge and talent and skills of our people. So we have to adapt to a knowledge economy that can sustain us. And as I said, the amount of information that we have and that we will need will be huge. So the work of information professionals, librarians, scientists, teachers will be crucial to this adaptation. And we are, of course, living in an age of information excess, as I've already hinted. I saw it written the other day that we create as much information in 2 days now as we did from the dawn of man through to 2003. And I'm going to tell you a lot of stuff you already know, but it's written here, so I've got to say it, because somebody out there will be watching. And a lot of this is user-generated content on things like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and Tumblr. I don't know what the last one is, I've heard of the first three. But it's also the result of science. You will have seen a splash over the weekend about the Square Kilometre Array and how it's a global collaboration that, in radio astronomy that will be built now across Australia and New Zealand as one pair of partners, and South Africa as well. And there will be 2 bits to it, and the Australian-New Zealand arm will stretch across the continent to New Zealand, and the South African arm will go, or the South African part, the Southern Africa, not South Africa, part will go north-south. As it becomes fully operational in the coming decades, it will generate 10 billion gigabytes of data a day. When I was talking to them about it, we don't have any capacity to do that, to handle that at the moment. We don't even have the computing power to handle that at the moment. So it's a good job it won't be fully operational for about 10 years or something, by which time we probably will have, and I'm optimistic that we will have. But if you put that into perspective, it's about the same amount of information as can be held on 1 billion smartphones. And what does all this data amount to? It amounts, in the right hands, data that translates into knowledge. And in the case of the SKA, the knowledge, of course, will help us address age-old questions like where we came from, how the planet's formed, things like the nature of dark matter and so on. But then you can put that alongside the explosion of genetics, and it's given us more data than we know what to do with, and probably deeply philosophical questions like what do we do with it once we know? Do you want to know what your genetic composition is, down to the fact that, well, we won't go into what it might show you, but it could get quite detailed information quite early in life about your future life expectancy. Do you want to know that at 25? Do you want somebody else to know that at 25? Do you want your employer to know that at 25? There are all sorts of issues that underpin a lot of this data, which goes back to the way we manage it too. But in genetics, it took about 10 years to analyse the 3 billion base pairs that's part of us. And it was first done in 2003. It can now be achieved in 1 week. And we talk about the $1,000 genome map. So all of you who've got a spare $1,000 can probably go out there now and find somebody who will give you a complete genomic map of you. And anybody else you can get a bit from to compare yourself with. But it's important to understand that when you multiply this by the number of people who might be interested in doing that, there is a huge amount of information that we will need to manage. So the world contains more data than we'll ever be able to touch, and that more data is being created even more rapidly. So clearly one of the key challenges for science and society is how to manage the large amounts. Without the capacity to do so, we'll lose the knowledge that it contains, and that would be a bad outcome. This has not gone unnoticed, and you probably know that the government has put in another 100 million or so a year, 312 over 3 years, in creating the e-research infrastructure. And the idea is to transform research and knowledge on a scale that certainly puts my days in the lab back into the dark ages, literally. I do remember when I was in England, we used to have to take our breaks according to the electricity was on, because we had 3 hours on and 3 hours off. I can remember walking home at 3 a.m. in the morning in order to get up to get back at 6 o'clock to turn the centrifuge on, because that's when the power came back on. That's a different story. They were literally the dark ages. Anyway, we have a lot of challenges ahead of us, colleagues, and we have to make some decisions. We have to decide what information has value and what doesn't. And here we have a crucial role for you to play. It's not just being a storehouse of information, perhaps as it might have been in the old days, but a place to build context and understand the world we live in. Like no other institution in society, libraries allow us to take knowledge and ideas and to add cultural context. And libraries are a link to the past and the story of how we are, of who we are, and how we got where we are. The value of libraries for the community can't be underestimated, nor those who work in them. I read the other day that the most important resource in the knowledge economy system is the talents who grasp knowledge. And I could say that would be you. Genuinely say that would be you. And it's a critical role as our understanding of what we need to do evolves. And we aren't there yet. We're still coming to terms with all this. I mentioned earlier that eventually the entire world will be dependent on the knowledge economy, and to be a strong global competitor in such an environment we need a capable, intelligent and skilled workforce. This means starting at the beginning we need students who are excited by knowledge, who are inquisitive, who have inquisitive natures and a passion to learn. In order for this to be facilitated, school library management, for those schools that still have libraries, advises that, and I quote, the evolution of school libraries into flexible, dynamic, high-tech learning centres designed to prepare students as responsible digital citizens to function effectively in a complex information landscape requires leadership. And that's true. And strategic planning, and that's true too. So I think it's where the libraries will play their part in the future. Important and critically important that we hone the inquisitive skills of our students and the people who pass through them at all ages, not just students, but of course with a particular importance to be placed on students, because sooner or later we're going to have to hand the baton on to them. Speaking as a former Vice-Chancellor and as a former scientist, university libraries are an indispensable resource for students, staff and researchers. A paper published by some Dutch people in 2002 pointed out that, I quote, in our era of knowledge society and knowledge economy, and I would say that looking back to 2002, the whole concept was quite embryonic in those days, and it's quite different now quantitatively, probably as well as qualitatively. But they wrote that it's clear that universities have a major role to play. In other words, universities are faced with a challenge to better create, disseminate knowledge to society. However, it was also argued that, quote, traditionally universities have been the sites of knowledge production, storage, dissemination and authorisation. The success of academic libraries depends on their ability to utilise information and knowledge of its staff to better serve the needs of the academic community. Slightly narrower view than we would put on it today, we would leave out the word academic and say serve the needs of the community through the academic processes and work. I don't think that the core principles will ever change. It's how we do it that will change. There is a prevalent and primary role that libraries play in our knowledge and will play in our knowledge economy, and they've evolved and will continue to do so. I mean, for me, for you, I'm sure. Thankfully, we don't have to hunt through reference cards anymore, or file them for that matter. But the students are still using the library for the same purpose that I did, to access knowledge and ideas, and probably to find somebody to go and have a drink with later. But the main point about it is that they go there to gather, harness, use and worry about information. And the way they do it will be different, but the purpose remains constant. In a digital age, the question may be asked, as I hinted at earlier, is there a place for books and papers and parchment? And here I think science answers an emphatic yes. Not everything can be digitised. As an example, a study was released early last year. Not everything can be or has been. As an example, a study was released early last year that contributes to the vast amount of historical data we have on climate change. Scientists' understanding of climate change hinges on the quality and length of historical weather observation. But in large parts of the southern hemisphere, records from observational instruments only cover the last 50 to 100 years. Fortunately, millions of observations lie buried in the logbooks and diaries of early European voyages, written decades before official meteorological stations were established. Researchers at the University of Melbourne were lucky enough recently to stumble on a daily logbook of weather observations, including temperature, barometric pressure and winds from the First Fleet's flagship HMS Sirius. And the researchers found the logbook at the State Library of New South Wales. From the logbook, they've compared each 18th century temperature and pressure reading against a modern climatology for each day's position, given by the ship's latitude and longitude, and providing a unique insight into 18th century weather. So although a single record covering a relatively short period of time is insufficient for assessing absolute changes in climate variability, such records are important for providing information of relative variability from a period where limited data are currently available. And it's not an isolated incident. Anatomical drawings, sketches of flora and fauna and age-old experiments have often been discovered in the safe confines of libraries. It's the skill of librarians to help scientists find it, however it's stored. And according to Google's Director of Technology, it will be about 300 years until computer is good as your local reference library in doing search. I understand that ALIA is still in the midst of celebrating Information Sharing Month, and it's important since libraries are also a place for collaboration and sharing ideas. Collaboration is increasingly important in the sciences. As I mentioned before, gone are the days of the lone researcher tinkering in his laboratory late at night. These days, science is conducted by teams of researchers often working across disciplines. As my office reported in our recently released Health of Australian Science report, almost 50% of scientific papers authored by Australians include a collaborative component with international collaborators. So it's not only growing, it's also internationalising. There are a lot of elements that contribute to our changing world, but this change has all come on the back of information turning into knowledge, turning into hard work, and we will always need keepers of that information and disseminators of that knowledge. Libraries are the bridge between knowledge and tangible results from that knowledge, certainly from a scientific research point of view. So I think colleagues at libraries will continue to play a very crucial role in the extension and storage and dissemination of our knowledge. When you think about your role as information custodians, from kindergarten students right through to the workforce and retired, the role of the library is formative in the development of our society, and for this I'm very grateful for all the hard work that you do. The work that you do might change, the pressures upon you might change, but the importance of what you do won't change. So thank you for inviting me here today to speak to you. Do you want questions, or now's your chance to tell me what you really want to know. Yeah. So I don't know really the answer to the question, because it would probably take a real economist to do it, and I at best would be an amateur at best. I will say this though, that way back in the 90s I used to sit on a board with a very senior trade union leader at that time, a man by the name of Laurie Carmichael. And Laurie then was deeply experienced, had been in the industrial movement for quite a long time on the union side. And he used to tell us this story about how in the even older days from now, Australia used to send steel tin sheets off overseas by the boatload, and would then buy it back as tin cans, empty. So we'd send off a boatload of whatever these sheets were made of, whatever alloy, buy it back when they were turned into cans, so we bought back a boatload of air, put Australian fruit in it and sent it back again. And at that time we were asking exactly those questions. What is it about Australia that means that we don't add a lot of that value here? We send off raw material and we buy it back with the value added at a much higher price. I saw recently in the Good Weekend magazine and the Fairfax newspapers an interview, a story about Australian entrepreneurs offshore. And in the middle of it all, they'd clearly asked Malcolm Turnbull what kept him awake at night. And he said one of the things that kept him awake, or maybe it was even the only thing, was why such a smart country as Australia can't earn more of its GDP from its own intelligence and wit than it does. And in a way, Laurie Carmichael in the 1990s, reflecting back on the 50s and 60s, and Malcolm Turnbull 3 weekends ago saying exactly the same thing, the same question you just asked. What do we not do well? And there is a serious push on now, I think, with increasing urgency, to try to come to terms with that, because we are going to have to get an answer to that question. So once you get past things like labour costs and all of the obvious, what is it that we're missing out on that other people know? 4% of our PhDs are in the manufacturing area. Switzerland has 28 doctorates per 1,000 in its workforce, and Australia has 8. Germany has 20. We have 8 researchers per 1,000 in our workforce, and so does Switzerland. So some of our most creative people are locked up in the research and development side. At the same time, you have people in Australia asking why we invest in R&D in Australia. Why don't we just get it in when we need it? So we've got a lot of work to do here to try to ensure that we get a really good answer to that question and do something about it before they get to the bottom of the hole. Yeah.
Professor Chubb, you seem quite certain that libraries need to be intermediaries between the scholar, the researcher and the community and the electronic knowledge that's out there. Why are you so sure about that?
I could only hear half of that. I think I missed the punchline. Because I'm talking to you. What do you want me to say? Go out and pass Centrelink on the way and collect 200. No. We have to have information managers. How we do it and what we do, how we filter it, if we filter it, for the purposes of a sort of scholarly community is one thing. The question that I have in my mind is that, say you have a system within the ANU or Australian Higher Education where there is an agreement that we will manage the information we want. It'll be a bit different institution by institution, but we manage the data we want in a particular way. My sense is that the community should get access to that too. So I'm talking about that bridge. Now, they will know that it's filtered. It's built for a purpose. It's not built to be the public library of the ACT. It's built to provide the information resources that scholars at the ANU want and need. But some of that also ought to be made available to the community of the ACT and Australia. And I think it's managing that interface better than we do. I mean, when I grew up, the time that I was referring to earlier about libraries, you couldn't get into the library unless you had a particular card with, not your photograph on it in those days, but an identity card that said you're a member of the university. That's probably still true. The question really is that you can, or the thing is that you can get into the ANU library with electronic access to get the whole of the ANU information world open to you relatively easily these days. So how are we going to manage all of that pressure and demand? Make sure we provide a resource for the ANU staff and students, most of whom will go into Google as well and won't be restricted to the library in particular. But I just think that we need to be able to manage the huge amount of data, manage effectively the huge amount of data and information that we're going to get thrown at us. And that will mean making selections, it will mean prioritising, and if people don't want to, and it'll mean concentrating effort, I think, and building up the massive information in a particular area. And if people want more than that, then they can go to other places. Yeah. Well, yeah, there is a place for that. I think that and I know these relationships go up and down, and I know that at ANU, for example, during my time here, most of the scientists accessed the library from their office desk and they probably knew where it was physically, but from wearing a path to it over the time, they shifted to staying there and just connecting from home or from their office. But I think that what they expected to get was a sort of systematic approach and a managed data resource. And I think that, I mean, if it's about how you develop that and how you share the respect for the two sides of that particular equation, then I do think it's important that we recognise that each is contributing substantially to the work of the other, and the support for the other. And how you do it, well, I don't know, depends on institutional culture as much as anything else. And if the respect comes from the top, then it is pervasive. And if it doesn't, then it fractures, because it's fragile. Yeah. Yes, I mean, I guess that it would depend on what the work was. I mean, I think you can imagine, for example, if we take the SKA to illustrate the point, and I'm now talking about something about which I know nothing except what SKA stands for. But if you take that and it produces this amount of information, then that amount of information has got to be accessible, available, and therefore collected in a way that makes it useful from the beginning. And I think a lot of what we do, we have information, we collect data, and then we work out later how to use it, and then we find out that it doesn't have everything we need embedded in it or with misbits or whatever. And so I, for example, am talking to the Australian Bureau of Statistics today about a longitudinal database that they're thinking of establishing, and I think it's a really good idea. But what they're trying to work out is what we want to get out of it, and then to work out what we need to put into it. Now, I can't tell them that as a scientist or as anything else for that matter. And I think to have people in who are deeply experienced in making information and data useful at the start of that process is a very important part of that process. So you could imagine that the answer to your question in that sort of context would be yes. We're looking at the moment on I chair a thing called the Australian Research Committee, part of which is to look at or to provide the government with a national research investment plan. And we're looking at the sort of meta levels. So what should Australia have to enable Australian researchers to meet the challenges of today, but also have a capacity to meet challenges that we can't even predict right now. And there are things that you would think that you would have in that. But at the end of it all comes down to data, managing information. So when we get, if all of that recommendation is accepted, those recommendations are accepted, then you would expect to find that people who know about that would be embedded into the process that leads to the turning of that idea into a policy and an implementation plan. So the answer to your question in that case would be yes. For me and my lab, the answer would be no. If I still had a lab. But what was important, sorry, let me just add to that. The answer would be no in the sense of embedded, but the importance of having people to whom you could speak about how to ensure that your experimental design was going to give you useful information, having access to such a person when you needed it was important. And sometimes that the person providing that skill, that knowledge, would be in the library, because that's where they were put. So getting people involved in that sort of way, but standing at the lab bench, turning this into this and seeing if it went blue was probably not the right place. But available and accessible, yes. That's what yeah.
As our chief scientist, how important is open access to you, and is it on your radar, and what do you see as your role in pushing that forward? For example, the NHMRC has fairly recently put forward policies similar to the NIH, where after a certain time period, things need to be deposited into repositories. ARC, to my knowledge, hasn't done a similar thing. Do you see yourself championing that?
So in principle, yes, I do. I think I've always taken the view that the results of publicly funded research should not only be available to those who can afford the cost of the journals in which it's published. I've never really understood why you pay people the privilege to take your copyright from you. I've not ever understood why it's good to pay somebody to have your article published in a journal that your library can't afford to buy. And that would apply to a whole lot of libraries in Australia, let alone in the developing world. And we've got to take that into account. I mean, we have an issue in Australia which I find intriguing, well, not in Australia, in the Western world, where the interest of 15-year-old students in studying science decreases according to where you are on the Human Development Index. So the better developed, or the higher you are on the Human Development Index of the United Nations, the less is the interest of 15-year-olds in studying science. What it means is that when you go up to the top of the graph and you find that the countries that are the least developed on that index, where the interest in studying science is as high as 60, 80%. Now I know that depends on how you ask the question and all that sort of stuff, and what the alternatives are, and so on. But let's just assume that the data are at least good signposts. Then those scientists working in those countries have to get access to the information that is being turned out of places like the ANU. And I'll bet you a pound to a peanut that they can't afford to spend 25 grand on one journal for 1 year's subscription. And we pay to get published in that journal. So it's a bizarre arrangement, and I think it's antithetical to the interests of humanity that we lock it up in that way. Now, I will say that I know that it's not easy. I know that there are a lot of people who are devoting a lot of their time to try to get around what some of the obstacles are. But if we have a clearly stated objective that we will do this, then it's easy to get around the obstacles because they just become impediments, not stoppers. When you're asking, should we do this, then you can find a lot of reasons why not. But I think NIH has got it probably right. I think NH and MRC's got it pretty close to right. I mean, I think there can be a period of time, all of that sort of stuff, but eventually it should be up there for anybody who wants to get access to it, to see it. Oh, of course. Now that I see that they've got a new chief executive, whom I know very well, of course. Man and boy. Yeah.
Because academic promotion is based on ERA calculations, which probably means publishing in those journals that you mentioned.
Well, it does for the moment, but it means, in essence, peer review. And of course, when you look at those journals, then you find peer review is what gets you into the sort of top-end journals and so on. So, you know, we are basically presumed to be fairly intelligent people. We find solutions for lots of things, and it should not be beyond our wit to work out how to do this and to have a system that allows us to examine the quality of research outputs, which personally I support wholly. I think working out how much money you get is not an indicator of quality, it's an indicator of how much money you get. And there may be some quality at the end of it, but you don't know unless you look. So we've got to have something that looks at outputs and outcomes, for that matter. But we need to devise a mechanism which also enables your academic community to feel that there's a quite rigorous and objective process that enables the quality on the one hand to be estimated, but at the same time enables them to put forward a case for promotion or whatever it might be. So I think universities have moved a long way on the promotion stakes. I think a lot more things are taken into account, say here, than 12 years ago before I arrived, because I think that was just part of the evolution of our sector. But a lot of the things that are done for good purposes in their own right don't fit easily into the jigsaw puzzle we're trying to construct. And we've just got to take it on. We've just got to say, we need two things out of this, and they've got to be compatible with one data set. The worst thing we can do to the sector is put in yet another requirement for yet more information that will go off somewhere and may or may not be used. So as I said, I don't think it's easy, but I do think that if our objective is to do it, then we will look at the solutions differently from asking whether or not we should do it.
That's been a very inspiring start to today's discussions. I'd like to thank you very much for coming to speak to us, to your old stamping ground, and hope you've enjoyed a bottle of red wine.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Okay. Everything's online.
So I've got an arthritic knee.
Thanks very much. Okay, while we're getting the technology set up, I will start on the next presentation and just start by explaining a little bit of the history of the study that was done for the Group of 8 into value frameworks for academic libraries. There are many different approaches to value frameworks, and the presentation that Helena and I are giving you today is about a study that was done for the Group of 8, which was initiated by Vic Elliott, my predecessor at the Australian National University. The presentation is based on the work that was done there, and I'll add a few contextual comments about the impact of the research, about the background to the methodology, and all of the slides from today, which have all of the detail of the report in it, are up on SlideShare, and there'll be a link on the ALIA blog, so you'll be able to see it. So what was the initiative? What was the value framework that was developed and used in this case? Well, the initiative took a cost-benefit study based on a return on investment to measure both in financial and qualitative terms the value of library-provided information resources to their research communities. It was commissioned by the Group of 8, initiated by Vic Elliott and conducted by Outcell. The methodology that was used is contingent valuation, which talks about willingness to pay and willingness to accept. And I thought it was probably worthwhile spending a couple of minutes putting the methodology into context. The contingent valuation methodology came out of the US in the 1970s, and the case that first established it was in fact a situation of the spoiling of natural resources. So things like there's an oil spill that takes out beaches in Alaska, takes out a national park. What does that mean? How can you go to court and make a claim for financial restitution from the company that caused that oil spill? There is, the value of the land in terms of sales doesn't really cover the value in terms of amenity to the people of parks, of the park, of the environment, and so the methodology that was developed was what were people willing to pay in order to have that amenity, what compromises were they willing to accept in that in the long term. So that's where the methodology came from, and it's based on scenarios of use. So the study itself had two parts. There was a quantitative study, an online survey assessment administered at the Australian National University, the University of Adelaide and the University of Queensland, and there was also validation of the methodology through focus groups at Monash University, the University of Melbourne, the University of New South Wales and the University of Sydney. Just a couple of definitions to start us off. It was only about the research community. It wasn't about undergraduate students, it wasn't about the teaching side, just about research. The constituent group for the assessment was all university staff engaged in research, and they may have been teaching or they may have been research-only staff. It included all postgraduate, pre- and post-doctoral research students, as well as research assistants working on behalf of researchers. The costs that were assessed as part of the project were the costs incurred in providing information resources in both digital and print formats for the research community, and information resources included print and digital resources that were made available to the research community. The response rate, there were 1,175 responses, and only 2 of them didn't complete all questions, so it was a valid sample from that point of view. Just some comments about demographics, because it's quite important when we think about the value of libraries to say what is the community that we're assessing. About 18.6% of the researchers who filled in the survey were from arts and humanities. About 24% were social sciences, 33% life sciences, about 20% physics and mathematical science, and about 5.5% were cross-disciplinary. So we had a range of metrics that we could analyse, so it wasn't just saying all researchers are equal, what are their needs and values, and what do they perceive the library is important to them in terms of a service, but it was actually broken down by subject areas as well. To the question, again a demographic question, when using resources made available to you by your university library, are you physically on the campus? About 17% said yes to that question, that they were always on the campus. Those that were less than 50% of the time on the campus were at 21%, and about 55% said more than 50% of the time. And Professor Chubb alluded to the fact that for a lot of our users these days, we don't see them in a face-to-face environment. It's quite a different value proposition from the time that Professor Chubb talked about when there were print journals, so you had to come into the library to be able to get the benefit of the service. Some of us even remember current contents on discs at CSIRO when you had a list of people who would take the discs and borrow it, and it was a 6-month track between the discs arriving and people being able to read the data. There were some interesting statistics. Okay. I'll keep talking. I can keep talking. Yes. It's a characteristic of most librarians, which is quite a good thing. One of the assessments, and I think it provides quite some interesting insights, is they were asked how often they used print or physical information resources. And there was and that's broken down by subject later on in the talk. From the highest to lowest in terms of use of print resources, journal articles were well up there, around 90% frequently or sometimes. Then books were the second highest used, abstracts, indexes and bibliographies the next highest, conference proceedings, and at the very tail end were standards, audiovisual, other and patent materials. So we're still operating in an environment, and in the open access environment as well, it's still the journal articles that are prime and books that were second most heavily used resources. In terms of the electronic information resources, it was even more starkly the case that electronic journals were the most used resources. Second were databases, abstracts, indexing services. Third were books, and there's quite a gap with books. And then the same sort of materials were used to a much less extent. So it gives an indication of if we're thinking about what parts of the collection we need to grow, where do we need to put our effort? And standards were remarkably low in that environment. We'll have the slides up shortly. Have you? Try. I think it'll come up. So yep. Oh, sorry. Maybe I'll just stand closer to it. Is that, I do apologise. Okay. In terms of time and resources, time and money spent on using information resources, there's a very interesting pattern for, has it come up? It's slow, all right.
for the amount of hours. We use the amount of hours as a proxy for the investment that people made in terms of dollars in using information resources. The metric was from less than 1 hour to over 40 hours spent using information resources. And we mapped the difference between electronic and print resources. The majority of use of electronic resources, people were spending roughly around 10 to 15 hours, primarily on electronic resources every single week. This study didn't break the issue of finding and reading down. It was very much focused on how much time are you spending reading articles and scholarly works. But the use of print resources was much less. The majority of people used were in the less than 1 hour and the 1 to 5 hour category. So it really indicated an enormous impact. I think if we ran this study is now about 2 and a bit years old. I think if we ran this study again, we would find an even higher increase in the use of electronic resources. It did indicate that absolutely fundamental to research was spending time reading. And the combined figures for ANU in terms of the amount of time spent reading online and print resources was very slightly higher than that of other group of 8 universities, but it was a very consistent pattern. The other interesting aspect, I think, for some of us to look at, particularly if you're in a special library, is how much are your clients actually spending on subscribing to information resources themselves. In terms of the spend, people were asked, did they spend nothing? Did they spend $100 to $250, $250 to $500, and then did they spend over $1,500 on resources? And the question was about spending out of their own pocket or from personal research funds. The highest number, it was around $444 people were spending individually on subscriptions to information resources, primarily electronic resources. So part of the challenge for us when we think about the value of libraries is to say, well, if there's all of these subscriptions happening, not necessarily we may not necessarily be responsible for them because it may be related to memberships of organisations, but can we have a role in making those accessible through our institution? In terms of the time and money spent on using electronic information resources, a question was asked about a number of statements, asking people if they agreed or not. The strongest agreement to there were 7 possible reasons for really believing that there's a high value in being made, in the library making resources freely available at the point of use. 7 statements were made. The one people agreed with mostly was it provides access to information resources which are indispensable for my research. About 90% of the respondents to the survey ticked the indispensable word. The next most common agreed statement was it's enabled me to maintain comprehensive high-level overview of developments in my field. And some of the comments that we see from our clients is not just that it enables access to developments in the field, but also it enables them to identify potential collaborators. Ian Chubb talked about the increasing importance of international collaboration and national collaboration, and libraries have been part of that. Perhaps the area in which of the 7 statements, we had the lowest set of agreement, which was less than half of the people who responded to the survey, was the suggestion that access to resources through the library has facilitated making applications for research funding. So that was not seen as being the most successful value add from the library in this category, but resources indispensable for the research and comprehensive overview of developments in the field were the highest. The third highest was it has helped me eliminate unproductive time. That is travelling to libraries because you can get it online. In terms of present funding arrangements, there was a good understanding that the university library was the primary facilitator of that. And they were also asked what they thought the expenditure was on libraries. And there were a number of options given in that framework. 6 optimists thought more than $30 million was spent on their library budget. 51 thought there was less than $1 million. So it's interesting to see the variability in those results. There were some qualitative questions about current services, how these resources met clients' needs. Not surprisingly at all, the journal articles were seen as meeting needs to the best level, and patents were seen to be meeting needs to the least level. However, the statistics on the use of information resources had shown that while there were, in this case, about 200 people who said, look, it doesn't really meet my needs well, that sort of moderated when you think about future directions for the library by the fact that people spent very little time looking at patents because it was not as relevant to the work that they were doing as journal articles and books. Ease of access was another question, and one of the values that Professor Chubb talked about and that our clients will often talk about is just meaning that finding that the library can give them a very quick pathway to information. A lot of us have invested in single search services to help people find things really quickly. And again, when asked about the ease of access, journal articles were seen to be the ones that we made available most easily. Patents were the lowest again. So, how's the technology? No, it's all right. We'll reset it at morning tea time, I think. We've also done a chart about the degree to which the needs are met that's graphic, so you can actually see it ranked in order of the ones that are the most important and valuable and how that's met. And again, journal articles are at the top. Abstracts, indexes and bibliographies in terms of the ease of access are second. Books are seen as third, which is interesting that those two move around. So in terms of value of money assessment that clients were asked to do, excellent and very good. Over 2/3 of the clients believed the library was a very high value for money service. And they were asked about different scenarios for funding the library. And given the variability, the figures indicated that clients would be willing to spend more than $5,000 for the range of information resources per title. Now, some work was done on different scenarios for funding information resources, and all of those slides are on the website. So I'm not going to go over those, partly because we're running slightly over time as well. But just some summary key highlight statistics from this value study. Overall, for about 5 hours per week are spent by researchers using printed information resources. The message we got really from the study is that the library helps that to be 5 instead of 15. There are about 11.5 hours spent a week using electronic resources. The total is about, for a researcher working in the environment, the 16.5 hours figure means that more than 2 days of the 5 days they work a week, they are actually reading and using information resources. And that 2/5 is quite an important piece of analysis. The annual expenditure from their own pocket is about $444 for research, and there are recommendations about the use of resources, the funding of resources in different models, all of which showed a value proposition for the library. There are 2 slides at the end that you'll be able to see on the website. I do apologise for this. Just in terms of subject hours, hours of use, we often think about the difference between science. Ian Chubb talked about science particularly, and humanities. The overall figure found that there was probably about 20% more use in the humanities of use of printed resources than there were of electronic journals, but I think one of the challenges for us in 2012 is to say, is that pattern changing? When this study was done 2.5 years ago, the number of e-monographs, e-books that were available and that we were delivering to clients was significantly less than is happening now, and one of the things we need to do is monitor trends. In terms of the items used, arts and humanities were slightly higher than physical sciences and life sciences, but interestingly social sciences were about the same. So to summarise the main findings, 98% of respondents agreed that the library provided access to information resources that were indispensable for their research. 96% agreed that access to library-provided information resources enabled them to maintain comprehensive, high-level overviews of developments in their fields. 83% reported that the range of depth of information resources met their needs at least adequately. 86% considered that ease of access to information was adequate. 92% valued the library as a value for money proposition. Perhaps the most impactful statistic that we collected from this study was that based on the return on investment study, savings realised through providing information resources centrally, free at the point of use for all affiliated researchers, is at least 136%. That is, for every dollar invested in the provision of information services, $1.36 is saved in terms of the time and purchases that would need to be done by individual researchers. That figure has been very influential within the university in terms of looking at the library in a different light. Lots of times people look at libraries and they think it's an expense, not a value proposition. The $1.36 is something that the very senior staff have talked about as being an important indicator of the library's impact, and that it needs to continue. It doesn't mean we don't have financial challenges, we all have financial challenges, but it put us into a framework where we could actually have a conversation that was based on dollars, not a conversation that was based on feeling good. So that, I think, was the greatest impact of the study.